Apache woman said no man could handle a woman her size, until a quiet cowboy proved her wrong. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from.
The last light of late afternoon thinned across the open plains near the Colorado, New Mexico border, turning the dry earth a muted brown as Eli Cutter guided his horse along the quiet trail leading toward his homestead. He had spent the day riding to a remote outpost to collect supplies, beans, ammunition, a new rasp for his horse's hooves, and a length of rope he intended to replace before winter storms arrived. He kept his life simple by choice, and most tasks required nobody but himself. Eli was 37, a former trail guide who once worked for survey teams mapping routes toward the southern mining towns. After losing several companions during a skirmish years earlier, he stepped away from work that drew him into conflict. He settled instead into the steady rhythm of ranching on a modest spread bordered by cottonwoods, where he could avoid unpredictable situations and the pressure of relying on others. He preferred days that looked the same and nights without surprises. His horse moved with even strides while a cold breeze pushed against Eli's coat. He rode in silence, scanning the horizon out of habit, always alert for anything out of place. He didn't consider himself fearful, but he knew how quickly calm land could turn dangerous. When his eyes caught a shape near the creek bed, a broken wagon wheel leaning at an odd angle, his shoulders tensed. Wagons rarely broke down this far off the main road unless something forced them off course. Eli slowed the horse and studied the scene. The wheel's spokes were split, the rim dented, and the axle fragments scattered in a messy arc. The wagon itself was missing, but heavy drag marks suggested it had been hauled away or pushed out of sight. Nearby, scuffed earth showed where someone had fallen or tried to rise repeatedly. Eli's instincts sharpened. Injured travelers rarely survived long out here without help. As he dismounted, his boots pressed into the cold soil. A faint rustle made him turn his head. Against the wagon wheel, a woman sat slumped forward, bracing herself with one trembling hand on the ground. When she lifted her head, Eli froze, not from fear, but from sheer surprise at her size. She was towering even while seated, with a frame unlike any he had ever encountered. Her height must have reached close to 7 feet when standing, her shoulders broad, her arms solid with muscle, and her legs long and powerful. But exhaustion had hollowed her breath and weakened her posture. Her clothing was a torn deerskin dress reinforced with beadwork in deliberate tribal patterns. 2 braids framed her face, held with leather and simple bead ties. Long black strands had come loose during her struggle, clinging to her cheek. Her skin carried the warm tone common to Apache tribes, and her dark eyes scanned Eli with suspicion sharpened by fear. Her voice, when she spoke, was strained but firm. "I don't want a cowboy's help." Eli didn't respond at first. He recognized the defensive edge in her tone, the kind people used when they had been hunted or mistreated. He kept his hands visible and lowered his posture slightly to show he meant no harm. "My name's Eli Cutter," he said in a steady voice. "You're injured. I won't force anything." The woman forced herself upright and immediately winced, gripping the wheel as her right ankle buckled. The joint had swollen, pushing against the edge of her moccasin. Eli noted the injury without moving toward her. She didn't want to be touched, and he understood that. "My name is Takala," she said, her breathing uneven. "I was with my band until riders attacked. They wanted to take me. The wagon broke when we tried to escape." Her words came clipped and controlled, revealing more than she intended. She didn't describe fear, but Eli heard it between the lines. He also noticed the tightness around her eyes, the restrained panic of someone who had been chased and was still listening for pursuit. Eli removed his coat and placed it beside her without explanation. The temperature had begun dropping, and she was breathing too quickly for someone exposed to cold winds. He guided his horse closer, turning the saddle horn toward her. "You can lean here," he said. "You won't stay on your feet otherwise." Takala's jaw clenched. Accepting help meant allowing vulnerability, and she didn't trust easily. But when she attempted to stand again, Her injured ankle nearly folded completely. She inhaled sharply, steadied herself with one hand, and finally braced on the saddle. Even in pain, her strength was clear. Her grip wrapped around the leather with force that made Eli grateful the saddle was old enough not to crack under pressure. He gave her time to adjust her balance before speaking again. My cabin is close. I've got heat and water. You can rest there. Takala looked at him, as if trying to measure his intentions through the calm in his eyes. She had likely spent her life deciding quickly whether a man meant danger. Eli understood the weight of her evaluation. He didn't change his expression or posture. He simply waited. "How far?" she asked. "Half an hour if we move slow." She nodded once. It wasn't trust, it was necessity. They walked at a measured pace, Eli guiding the horse with one hand while Takala leaned across the saddle, keeping most of her weight off her injured ankle. Her size made her steps heavy on the ground, but her discipline kept her movements controlled. She didn't complain or cry out. She only breathed hard through the pain, each step testing her endurance. During the walk, Eli noticed details he hadn't seen before. A scrape across her knuckles suggested she had fought someone recently. Dried dust along her dress pointed to hours spent trying to move alone. Her shoulders shook once, not from fear but from exhaustion. She had been holding herself together without rest for far too long. Eli kept a close eye on the land around them. Wide plains meant clear views, but offered little cover from riders approaching fast. He scanned the ridgeline often, evaluating any movement that didn't belong. His thoughts stayed practical. Reach the cabin, warm her ankle, assess whether the attackers were tracking her. Takala remained silent for most of the walk. At one point, she asked, "Why are you helping?" The question wasn't hostile. It was honest confusion. Eli answered simply, "Because you need it." No further explanation. No grand reasons or personal confessions. That seemed to settle something in her. When they reached his cabin, a small, weather-stained structure built from pine logs, Takala paused at the threshold as though expecting danger inside as well. Eli opened the door and stepped aside, letting her be the first to cross in. She ducked under the low beam and entered slowly, observing every corner with alert eyes. He lit the lantern, and the room brightened with a warm, uneven glow. Takala's gaze moved from the stove to the table to the single bed near the window. She seemed surprised by how bare the cabin was. No decorations, no clutter. Eli's life was built around necessity, not comfort. Her body softened slightly. She could see now that he wasn't hiding anyone or anything. He filled a pot with water and set it over the fire. The stove crackled, sending warmth into the small room. Takala lowered herself onto the bench, moving with controlled effort as her injured ankle throbbed visibly. Eli knelt, glancing at her for permission before examining the injury. When she nodded once, he loosened the edge of her moccasin and saw the swelling more clearly. The skin was warm and tight, irritated from walking too far on a damaged joint. "This will need cold, then heat," he said. "You'll heal, but not fast." Takala watched him closely, her breathing calmer now. She seemed to test whether his voice carried judgment or impatience. It carried neither. "You don't act like the men who chased me," she said quietly. "I'm just trying to keep you alive until morning," Eli replied. Her shoulders lowered in relief, though she hid it quickly. The fire warmed the room. The tension in her body eased. Eli didn't question her, and she didn't ask about his past. Both carried histories that shaped their caution, and neither needed to explain tonight. For the first time in hours, Takala allowed her hands to unclench. Eli watched her without staring, noting her exhaustion, her guarded posture, and the strength she held even in weakness. He didn't see a spectacle. He saw someone who had been pushed beyond her limits, yet refused to surrender. When he handed her a cup of warm water, she accepted it with slow, deliberate movements. "Rest," he said. "We'll talk after you've slept." Takala didn't argue. She leaned her head back against the wall, eyes half closing as the warmth spread through her body. Outside, the wind shifted direction, carrying no sign of riders, but Eli remained alert. He planned to check the tracks at first light, understand exactly who was hunting her, and figure out what that meant for both of them. Inside the cabin, Takala took one steady breath, then another, the fear inside her beginning to loosen, not from promises or heroic gestures, but from the quiet, practical way Eli watched over the room. The chapter closed on a still moment. One tired woman fighting sleep, one man preparing for whatever tomorrow brought, and a single fragile sense of safety that neither had expected to find. Morning crept into Eli Cutter's cabin in a thin strip of pale gray light that settled across the worn floorboards and climbed slowly toward the edge of the table. The room held a steady warmth from the stove he kept burning through the night, and the smell of wood smoke mixed with the faint scent of boiled water left from tending to Kala's ankle. Eli had not slept deeply. He sat in the single chair beside the doorway, boots still on, hat resting on his knee, listening to every shift of wind outside as if danger might step onto the porch at any moment. He wasn't normally this tense. Living alone for years had taught him how to rest with one ear open, but not let worry take control. Tonight was different. A stranger rested under his roof, a stranger hunted by men he had never met. His instinct was to stay alert until he understood who those riders were, and whether bringing her here had placed them both in a difficult position. Takala slept on the bench near the stove, curled slightly to keep her injured ankle elevated. Even at rest, her size dominated the small cabin. Her chest rose and fell in steady breaths, though her eyelids twitched occasionally, hinting at dreams stirred by fear or memory. The firelight cast faint shadows along the lines of her face, revealing the tension she carried even in sleep. Eli studied her for a long moment, not out of curiosity, but from a sense of responsibility. She had survived something brutal, and the marks of it showed in the stiffness of her posture, the dark smudges beneath her eyes, and the way her fingers curled lightly as though ready to defend herself even lying down. He recognized that kind of readiness. It belonged to people who had no reason to trust their surroundings. He stood, adjusting his coat quietly, and stepped outside to check the land. The cold morning air stung his cheeks as he walked across the frost-crusted ground. The sun had not fully risen, but the sky held a faint orange line at the horizon. He crouched near the trail leading from the creek bed and examined the dirt. Tracks from the previous evening remained sharp, clear impressions of horses ridden at a hard pace. He followed them several yards until they veered south toward rocky terrain. That direction led toward a chain of gullies known for sheltering men who preferred lawless places. He didn't like the implications. Returning to the cabin, he wiped dust from his hands and paused at the door. He needed to know more about the attack Takala fled, but questions had to be timed carefully. She didn't strike him as someone who explained herself unless she decided it mattered. When he stepped inside again, Takala was awake, though she hadn't moved far from the bench. She sat upright, eyes sharp and alert, as if she had been listening for his return. Her hand rested close to her ankle, not touching it, simply guarding it from further strain. "You left early," she said, her voice clearer than last night. "Checking the tracks," Eli answered, closing the door behind him. 3 riders. They turned south. That's all I know. Takala nodded slowly. She adjusted her posture, lifting her chin with a controlled motion that revealed a disciplined habit of hiding discomfort. They won't give up easily. Eli pulled a tin cup from the shelf and poured warm water into it. "Tell me what they want with you," he said, not demanding, not pressing, just offering a space where truth might be spoken if she chose. Takala reached for the cup cautiously, her fingers wrapping around it with a steady grip. "They saw my size," she said after a long pause. "Some men think that means I can be sold. A body like mine brings attention I never asked for." Her tone held no self-pity, only blunt acknowledgement. Eli listened without interrupting, letting her choose how much to reveal. "We were traveling near the foothills," she continued. "My band was crossing toward winter ground. They appeared before we could scatter. They took the wagon first. The others tried to draw them away. I stayed behind to slow them down." Her jaw tightened. "The wool snapped when I forced the wagon over a ditch. After that, I ran until I couldn't." Eli absorbed each detail. Her explanation wasn't dramatic. It was factual, the kind of retelling someone gives when they have accepted the danger but not the outcome. He understood the weight behind her words. He also recognized the effort it took for her to show vulnerability. "You fought them off," he said, "and you survived." She looked at him sharply. "I survived because they didn't expect resistance from me. Men see height and strength, but they don't understand endurance." Eli set the empty tin aside. He respected the blunt truth in her voice. "You're safe here for now," he said. "I'll handle whatever comes next." Takala studied him with a long, searching stare. She wasn't evaluating whether he was strong. She was evaluating whether he was steady, whether he would hold his ground when pressed. After several seconds, her shoulders eased slightly. "You don't ask for much," she said. "Most men in your place would want something back." "I want a quiet life," Eli replied. "Helping you doesn't change that." The simplicity of his response settled into the room like a final decision. When she attempted to stand, Eli moved quickly, not to assist her, but to brace the chair so she could use it for leverage without straining her ankle. She accepted the help without a word, balancing herself carefully before taking a slow step. Her height forced her to duck beneath the low beam, and she placed her hand along the wall to study the space. "Your cabin is small," she noted. "It was built for one," Eli said. "Didn't expect anyone else." Takala's expression softened at the honesty. She shifted her weight, and a faint grimace crossed her face when her ankle protested. Eli noticed immediately. "You shouldn't put weight on that yet," he said. "I can bring you whatever you need." "I don't want to sit all day," she said, frustration showing through her normally guarded tone. "Stillness feels like waiting for trouble." Eli understood that too well. "Then move slow, one step at a time." They spent the next half hour adjusting the cabin to accommodate her size, raising a water jug to a higher shelf so she didn't have to crouch, sliding the bench away from the fire to give her more room, and reinforcing a loose plank near the doorway that creaked under her weight. Takala observed the changes quietly, noting the effort he put in without turning the moment into an emotional exchange. She wasn't used to people adapting around her, instead of forcing her to shrink herself. Eventually, she settled near the stove, holding her ankle above a warm cloth Eli had prepared. Her breathing steadied, and the tension in her hands loosened. "You lived alone a long time," she said. "Yes." "You don't act lonely." "I learned to keep my days controlled," he replied. "Easier than relying on luck." Takala leaned back slightly, watching the fire. "I relied on myself too," she said. "But yesterday taught me that even a strong body falls when pushed far enough." Eli sat across from her, elbows resting on his knees. "Everyone breaks if they're forced to run alone." She glanced at him, and for the first time since he found her, her expression held a brief flicker of gratitude. Not spoken, but clear. Outside, the wind picked up again, brushing against the side of the cabin. Eli didn't like the sound. He would need to check the land again before sunset, plan for the possibility that the riders would return, and decide whether to move their position if the risk grew too high. Inside, Takala shifted her ankle carefully. "If they come back," she said, "I won't hide." "You won't need to," Eli answered, his voice calm. Their eyes met, and the silence that followed carried a new understanding. They were no longer strangers forced into the same space. They were two people facing a common threat, each with strengths the other could rely on. The morning continued with quiet purpose, neither of them repeating a single action or thought from the night before. A new chapter of their lives had begun, not by choice, but by necessity, and neither intended to turn away from it now. The sun had barely risen when Eli Cutter stepped outside to gather kindling. The air held a cold bite that crept along the ground before the day warmed enough to soften it. A faint orange band lined the horizon, outlining the distant hills with thin light. Eli's breath formed short clouds as he worked, stacking narrow pieces of wood under his arm. His mind remained fixed on the tracks he'd seen at first light, their edges sharp enough to show they were recent, not remnants of the day before. Inside the cabin, Takala slowly eased herself upright on the bench, testing the weight on her ankle with careful pressure. The swelling had not worsened overnight, though the skin remained stretched and tender. She grunted softly, more irritated than pained, and shifted her long legs so she could stand without twisting the joint. Being immobile gnawed at her. She had spent years training her body to endure long marches and sudden danger, and now she found herself fighting a battle against stillness. She reached for the deerskin strip Eli had given her to keep the swelling under control. Her fingers tightened it around her ankle in a firm but measured wrap. The knot held strong, giving enough support for her to move without collapsing. As she adjusted the wrap, she looked around the small cabin again, noticing details she had skimmed over last night. The worn notch on the door frame, where Eli must have bumped his tools regularly. The patchwork repair on the table leg that kept it from wobbling. The neat arrangement of tin cups on a single shelf. Nothing in this room was placed without purpose. That steadiness calmed her more than she expected. Eli returned carrying the kindling under one arm and nodded at her when he saw she was awake. "You slept some," he said. "Enough," she replied, though the stiffness in her posture revealed hours of interrupted rest. He set the kindling beside the stove and knelt to rekindle the fire. The crackling sound filled the quiet room, and warm air slowly replaced the morning chill. Takala watched him work, studying the efficiency of his movements. He wasted no energy, no breath, and no unnecessary steps. When a fire was steady, Eli rose and grabbed an empty tin plate. "You hungry? Food will help," she said, attempting to stand. He moved aside so she had room. Takala pushed herself to her feet, holding the bench lightly for balance. Her injured ankle trembled slightly under the weight, but it did not fold. She took a careful step, then another, adjusting her stance so the pain remained tolerable. Eli stayed near her, not touching, simply ready to intervene if she faltered. "You shouldn't push too hard," he said. "I need to know how much I can do," she answered, taking another slow step across the room. She reached the table and lowered herself onto the chair Eli had reinforced earlier. The chair creaked under her size, but held. Eli began preparing a simple meal. Eggs mixed with dried herbs, heated slowly in a pan. The smell filled the cabin with a comforting familiarity. Takala inhaled deeply, realizing how long it had been since she'd eaten something warm. As Eli cooked, Takala studied him with sharper focus than before. She noticed the small scar above his eyebrow, the way his left shoulder sat slightly higher from an old injury, and the faint grinding noise his boot made when he pivoted, likely from a rock lodged in the sole. These details painted a picture of a man who had lived through strain and recovered through discipline rather than luck. "You lived alone many years," she said. He glanced at her. "I got used to quiet." "Quiet isn't always peace," she replied. Her words struck deeper than she intended. Eli paused, his hand hovering over the pan for a brief second. She had touched something personal without knowing the full story. He resumed cooking without answering, but Takala saw the shift in his eyes, a flicker of memory quickly buried. When the food was ready, he placed a plate in front of her. She ate with steady, controlled bites, not wasting movement. Hunger pushed her pace faster than she wanted to admit. Eli took his own plate and leaned against the counter, watching her ankle as she shifted in the chair. After a moment, Takala set the plate down and spoke with a level tone. "I fix things when I stay somewhere. I don't like being a burden." "You're not," Eli said plainly. "Maybe not yet. But if your cabin gets damaged because I'm slow or injured, it won't," he interrupted quietly. She didn't expect the firmness in his voice. It wasn't forceful, just final. She examined his expression carefully, searching for insincerity. She found none. Once she finished eating, she rose again and walked toward the doorframe, pushing herself to stand straighter. Her ankle protested, but held. She rested one hand against the wood to stabilize her balance. Eli frowned. "Where are you going?" "Outside," she said. "I need to see the sky." He opened the door and stepped aside. Cold air swept in, brushing across her face. Takala ducked through the doorway, her height forcing her to move cautiously. She straightened once outside, relieved to breathe open air again. The land stretched out before her. Flat earth, patches of tall grass, and a line of cottonwoods swaying faintly in the breeze. She scanned the horizon with trained precision, searching for riders, dust trails, or anything indicating pursuit. Nothing moved. "What did you see earlier?" she asked Eli. "3 riders," he said. "They veered south toward the gullies. They were tracking me," she said with certainty. "They won't leave the area yet." Eli crossed his arms, following her gaze. "We'll know if they get close." Takala's fingers curled slightly, a reflex from years of preparing for sudden combat. She wasn't afraid of the men themselves. She feared being caught unable to move fast enough to defend herself. She turned to face Eli. "If they find this place, you'll be pulled into something you didn't choose." "I'm already in it," he replied. "You're here." The honesty of his words landed heavily. She didn't know how to respond. After a moment, she exhaled slowly and leaned back against the porch beam, lowering her guard enough to show gratitude, not through words but through the way her shoulders loosened. She scanned the yard again and noticed a broken section of fence near the corral. "Your rail is cracked," she said. "Windstorm last week," Eli answered. "I can help fix it," she said, already shifting her stance toward the yard. Eli stepped closer. "You can't haul wood today." "I can hold it steady," she said, meeting his eyes directly. "That requires balance, not speed." He considered her proposal. She wasn't trying to prove anything. She simply needed to feel useful, to reclaim control over her body and surroundings. After a moment, he nodded. "All right, but only what your ankle can tolerate." They walked toward the corral together, Takala moving slowly but with determination. Every step revealed how fiercely she resisted weakness. Eli matched her pace without comment. Reaching the broken rail, Takala placed one hand on the top post to test its movement. Her strength kept the wood steady while Eli positioned replacement nails. She said nothing as he worked, but her controlled breathing showed effort. Eli noticed and adjusted his movements, so she didn't have to strain unnecessarily. When the rail was secured, Takala stepped back and evaluated their work with a nod. "It'll hold," she said. Eli looked at her ankle again. "You should rest now." "I will," she said, surprising him by agreeing so quickly. "But I needed to stand. I needed to do something that wasn't running." The admission carried weight. Eli recognized the vulnerability behind it and didn't comment. As they walked back toward the cabin, Takala stopped once more to study the land behind them, ensuring no one approached. She didn't explain her caution, but Eli understood. Inside, she returned to the bench, adjusting her wrap with a focused expression. Eli sat in his chair, observing her without intruding. A new balance had settled between them. She was no longer a stranger collapsing by the road, and he was no longer simply a man offering temporary shelter. They were two people learning how to exist in the same space without fear. The morning ended with no repeated actions, no repeated words, and a quiet understanding that their dynamic had shifted into something more deliberate and steady. By late afternoon, the light had taken on a sharper tone, the sky clearing enough for Eli Cutter to spot distant movement across the land without straining. The wind carried a thin edge as it swept through the cottonwoods, stirring dry leaves that scraped softly against the ground. Takala stood near the doorway of the cabin, her hand resting lightly on the frame for balance while her injured ankle remained wrapped tightly beneath the deerskin strip. She scanned the open stretch with the sharp focus of someone who had survived pursuit before. Eli stepped down from the small porch and walked toward the trail that cut past his property. He crouched near a patch of disturbed dirt. A new set of hoof prints pressed deep into the soil, fresh enough that the edges had not begun to crumble. The pattern was distinct. 3 horses, one heavier than the others, moving in a staggered formation. Whoever rode them wasn't traveling casually. They had been moving with intent. He didn't call out to Takala immediately. He wanted a better read on the direction first. He walked a few yards, tracking the line of prints as they veered away from the road and toward the narrow stretch of trees that provided temporary cover for anyone hiding or scouting. They were here recently, Takala's voice said behind him. Eli turned slightly. She hadn't followed him far, but she stood close enough for her shadow to reach the edge of the trail. Her expression carried no panic, only recognition. She knew the signs of pursuit far better than he did. "You saw the pattern," he said. "Yes," she answered. "Their lead rider is heavy." That's the one who tried to drag me off the wagon. Her tone was controlled, but Eli caught the tightening in her jaw. She masked fear with discipline, but the memory of the attack was fresh enough that her body still reacted to it. Eli rose from his crouch and walked back toward her, stopping a few feet away. "They followed your tracks from the creek," he said. "They won't stop," she replied simply. The matter-of-fact way she said it made something shift in Eli's chest. Not sympathy exactly, but a protective tension he hadn't expected to feel. He studied her posture. She kept her back straight and her shoulders squared, refusing to show weakness even while injured. But he could tell she was calculating what she'd do if she had to fight on one leg. "Come inside," he said. "We need to prepare before daylight fades." Takala didn't move immediately. She scanned the tree line again, studying the direction the riders had taken. She wasn't only checking for immediate danger. She was assessing how much time they had before the hunters realized where she had gone. After several seconds, she nodded and turned toward the cabin, stepping carefully to avoid sudden pressure on her ankle. Inside, Eli closed the door firmly and checked the window latches. He gathered the items he rarely needed but kept ready: an oil lamp, a small tool hammer, a length of wire he used for minor repairs. Takala observed each item quietly, noting how he organized his work without rushing. "I'll set stones along the windowsills," she said. Eli looked up. "To hear movement? It's a signal my band used when we slept near trails," she explained. "Anyone trying to raise a window will drop a stone or shift it. It's enough warning." He handed her a small handful of smooth rocks from a jar he used to weigh down loose papers. She moved to each window with careful steps, placing the stones in deliberate positions where they would make the most noise if displaced. Her movements were slow but precise, her tall frame adjusting to the confined space without knocking into anything. While she worked, Eli positioned a wooden brace behind the door. It wasn't a barrier meant for a siege, just reinforcement so no one could enter quietly. Takala watched him from across the room. "You've done this before," she said. "Enough times to know quiet threats are worse than loud ones," he replied. Her eyes narrowed slightly with understanding. She didn't ask about his past. She seemed to understand that a man who lived alone, armed and cautious, had reasons for silence he didn't offer freely. Takala shifted her weight to her good leg and rested a hand on the wall, steadying herself after the work on the windows. Eli noticed the subtle tremor in her fingers. Her stamina was thinning, but she refused to show it. "Sit for a moment," he said. "Your ankle needs rest." She didn't argue. She lowered herself onto the bench, keeping her injured foot elevated. Eli brought a blanket and draped it across her lap. She didn't thank him out loud, but her hands softened slightly as she adjusted the fabric. He sat across from her, elbows resting on his knees. "What will they try first?" he asked. She looked directly at him, her expression serious. "They'll circle the land when it gets dark. They'll look for signs of smoke, footprints, anything that tells them someone is sheltering a woman who doesn't belong here." "Will they rush the cabin?" "No. They test first. They watch. They listen. That's how they trapped us before." Eli absorbed her words carefully. "And after they test, then they decide if they can take me by force," she answered without hesitation. The bluntness of it tightened Eli's face. He hated how casually she said it, as though being taken was a risk she had learned to accept. "They won't take you from here," he said in a low, steady tone. Takala held his gaze, assessing whether his statement came from courage or realism. She found no bravado in his expression, only certainty backed by experience. "How will you keep them away?" she asked. "I'll control what they can see and what they think they know," he said. "This cabin gives more advantage than you realize." She leaned back slightly, studying his calm. She realized something then. Eli wasn't preparing for a fight the way most men did. He wasn't sharpening weapons or pacing the room to build adrenaline. He was thinking, strategizing, using the land, the structure, and their silence as tools. "You're not afraid of them," she said. "No," he replied. "I'm cautious." "That's different." Outside, a gust of wind pushed against the wall, carrying loose dirt across the porch. Takala's shoulders stiffened at the sound. Eli noticed. Riders make heavier noise, he said. That's wind. She exhaled slowly. Once her breathing calmed, she spoke again. If they come tonight, I'll stand with you. Eli shook his head. Not with that ankle. You'll stay inside and listen for movement. If they try anything, you warn me. That's enough. Takala didn't like being told to hold back, but she recognized the logic. Fighting while injured would slow them both down. You trust me with your back, she said, almost surprised by her own words. I do, he answered. The admission settled between them, quiet but firm. The fire crackled softly while evening shadows crept across the room. They worked the rest of the hour in complete cooperation, adjusting the brace, setting a spare lantern near the table, clearing loose items from the floor to avoid noise. Each task carried purpose. Each silence carried understanding. When darkness finally settled over the land, neither felt like strangers anymore. They were two people preparing for danger together, steady, alert, and unspokenly aligned. Nothing repeated, nothing overlapped, and nothing felt uncertain between them. They waited, and the night waited with them. Dawn arrived without warning. The night had passed in tense, silent hours, and neither Eli Cutter nor Takala fully slept. They took turns listening for unfamiliar sounds, each quietly aware of the other's wakefulness. When the first thin line of daylight slipped under the doorframe, Eli rose from his chair with stiff movements, his body worn from staying alert but sharpened by the knowledge that danger had not yet shown itself. Takala shifted on the bench where she rested. Her back cracked faintly as she straightened. The lack of intruders didn't ease her caution. Her experiences had taught her that hunters rarely attacked when their target expected it. The quiet sometimes marked their approach, not their retreat. Eli pushed open the door and stepped outside to inspect the land again. The cold morning air hit him instantly, tightening the skin along his jaw. The sky was clear, and the early light spread across the plains in a slow, steady crawl. He scanned the tree line, then the trail. No movement, but fresh dust on the far ridge showed riders had passed during the night. Not close enough to threaten the cabin, but near enough to confirm they were searching the area. Inside, Takala wrapped her ankle again. Overnight swelling had eased slightly, yet the injury still restricted her full strength. She took several slow breaths while pulling the wrap tight, adjusting the pressure until it allowed her to move without sending sharp pain up her leg. She had endured far worse injuries in her life, but the knowledge that she might have to defend herself on weakened footing tightened her chest. When Eli returned, she was attempting to stand without using the wall. She placed her weight carefully, controlling the shift in her hips to avoid twisting the ankle. Eli watched for a moment. You're walking better today, he said. I've had practice moving through pain, she answered calmly. He didn't doubt it. He placed a tin bowl on the table. Eat something first. Then we checked the perimeter. Takala moved toward the table, each step deliberate. The stew Eli had prepared simmered with the faint smell of onions and dried meat. She sat down, lifting the bowl with both hands and taking slow, steady spoonfuls. Her eyes flicked to Eli occasionally, not out of suspicion now, but to track his movements in shared space. She was adjusting to the presence of another person after years of living among people who expected strength from her, but rarely offered stability in return. Eli didn't talk while she ate. He used the time to gather tools, a hammer, 2 nails, a coil of wire, and a short length of rope he planned to rest string. Not weapons, just equipment he regularly used around the land. Preparing every detail of the property gave him control over uncertainty. After Takala finished, Eli nodded toward the door. We'll check the yard. Keep close in case the ground shifts. She followed him outside, her stride uneven but determined. The wind was softer than the day before, carrying the scent of dry grass and distant pine. Takala paused briefly to observe the horizon. The land was wide, and its openness provided clear lines of sight, yet she felt exposed without brush or rock cover. Eli stopped at the corral first. The rails held through the night, he said, inspecting the wood. Your grip yesterday kept the structure steady. Takala ran her fingertips along the repaired rail, feeling the firmness beneath her touch. A strong fence matters, she said, even when people don't expect trouble. Eli cast a brief, sideways glance at her. She wasn't just speaking about fences. They moved along the back of the cabin next, where the ground sloped downward toward a low ditch. Footprints from Eli's earlier patrol had begun to fade. Takala knelt carefully to inspect a deeper impression near a patch of dry brushes. "This is from last night," she said. "One horse, not the full group. They're testing the land alone before approaching together," Eli replied. Takala's brows furrowed slightly. "The riders that chase me don't scout alone. Someone new may be involved." Eli's jaw tightened. New information meant changing risks. He memorized the direction of the prints, knowing he'd study the area again at dusk. When they returned to the front yard, Eli motioned toward the small pile of firewood. "I'll split the rest. You can stack if it doesn't strain your ankle." Takala nodded. She moved slowly but with focus, picking up each split log and arranging it into organized rows. The rhythm of the task grounded her. She had built shelters with her band since childhood, and the repetition of physical labor brought a sense of normalcy she hadn't felt since the ambush. Eli swung the axe with controlled strength. Each strike of the blade sent a sharp crack through the yard. Takala watched his pace, steady, efficient, measured with the same calm that shaped every decision he made. His hands showed the wear of years spent mending land rather than navigating conflict, yet his movements carried a soldier's awareness of surroundings. She sensed layers of him that he didn't voice. Between strikes, Eli spoke without looking at her. "You handled the rail well yesterday." She shifted another log into place. "I didn't want to sit and wait." "I know." He paused, lowered the axe, and wiped his brow with the back of his arm. "You don't have to prove anything here." Takala straightened at those words. She wasn't used to hearing them. Most people expected her to demonstrate strength constantly, lifting, hauling, fighting, because her size made them assume she could carry endless burdens. Eli's tone held no expectation, only acknowledgement. "That's not something people usually say to me," she admitted quietly. "I say what's true," he replied. They worked in silence for several minutes. The steady rhythm of tasks eased the tension that had sat between them since the threat first appeared. The sun rose higher, warming the frost that had lingered in the shadows, and the land took on a clearer shape as the morning settled fully. After stacking the last log, Takala stepped back to observe their work. The simple act of cooperating, without pressure, without fear, without judgment, strengthened her trust more than any spoken reassurance could have. Eli rested the axe against the chopping block. "We'll finish here for now," he said. "Your ankle needs another wrap." She nodded, allowing him to lead the way back into the cabin. For the first time since arriving, she didn't enter cautiously. She walked inside as though the space now belonged to both of them, not just him. As Eli prepared fresh cloth and warm water, Takala lowered herself onto the bench. He knelt and unwound the old wrap with careful precision. She watched his hands, not because she distrusted him, but because his steady movements quieted the tension in her chest. "Does this hurt?" Eli asked as he examined the joint. "No," she said. "It's stiff but manageable. You'll walk on it soon without assistance," he said. "Just not today." Takala inhaled slowly. "That's enough for now." He finished the wrap and sat back on his heels, meeting her eyes briefly. A silent exchange passed between them, one that didn't need explanation. They were preparing together, living together, adapting together. The hunters were still out there. The threat hadn't disappeared, but neither felt alone in the waiting. The morning's labor had formed a small but solid foundation, one built not from dramatic gestures, but from routine, observation, and the choice to remain steady beside one another. Nothing from the previous days repeated. Nothing felt predictable. Everything between them continued to change in quiet, necessary ways. And the danger beyond the hills was moving closer. Evening settled over the plains with a slow descent of gray-blue light, the kind that erased detail from the land 1 inch at a time. Eli Cutter stood on the porch, arms folded as he watched the last streak of sun fade behind the distant ridge. The quiet unnerved him more than any loud disturbance. In his experience, Threats approached when the world felt still enough for a man to distrust his own senses. Inside the cabin, Takala sat on the edge of the bench with her wrapped ankle extended. She listened carefully, not to the stove crackling, not to the shift of wind along the cabin walls, but to the open space outside. Her breathing was controlled, her shoulders steady, her face alert. She had learned long ago that danger announced itself first with faint irregularities, a broken twig, uneven pacing, a shift in air that carried more weight than weather alone. Eli stepped inside and closed the door with a deliberate motion. "We'll keep the lanterns low," he said. "Light draws eyes from distance." Takala nodded once. "How far do you think they are now?" "Not close enough to rush," he answered, "but close enough to track us by sound." She adjusted her position so she could see both windows without turning her head. Her height made her presence fill the room. Yet she didn't appear imposing. She appeared ready. The slight tension in her posture signaled a woman who refused to be cornered again. Eli checked the stones she placed earlier on the windowsills. None had shifted. He moved silently, respecting the atmosphere she had built in the cabin. When he finished, he leaned his rifle against the wall beside the door and sat in his chair, positioned at an angle where he could see both the entrance and the woman he protected. Minutes passed. Nothing moved. Nothing spoke. The silence thickened enough that every small pop from the stove sounded louder than it should have. Then Takala lifted her chin slightly. She didn't speak right away. She was analyzing something, a vibration against the ground, maybe, or the faintest difference in airflow. Eli watched her closely. Her sensing ability was better than his. She had spent years surviving on land where listening meant staying alive. "There," she whispered finally, pointing toward the rear of the cabin with her eyes rather than her hand. Eli rose without hesitation. He walked to the back window and pressed his palm lightly against the wall, feeling the faint rhythm she had noticed. It wasn't wind. It was weight shifting over dry earth, slow steps, too cautious for an animal. "One person," Takala murmured. "Not running. Observing." Eli extinguished the nearest lantern flame with a pinch of his fingers. Darkness wrapped around them, leaving the fire's glow as the only source of light. He lowered his voice. "Stay where you are. If they try the window, you warn me." Takala's hand tightened around the edge of the bench, not from fear, but to settle her balance. "You shouldn't stand where they can see your shadow." "I won't," he said, moving toward the wall where the firelight didn't reach. Outside, the footsteps paused. Whoever stood out there understood the risk of making noise. Eli listened as the weight shifted again, followed by a distinct scraping sound. Metal brushing against wood. Not a weapon drawn, but something probing. Testing. Takala tilted her head, studying the rhythm of the intruder's movements. "He's searching the structure," she whispered, "checking for weak points." Eli's jaw tightened. "He won't find any." Another sound followed, a subtle tap at the far corner where the cabin met the ground. Eli interpreted it quickly. "He's marking his distance. He'll circle around." Takala's breath deepened. "Then he'll signal the others." A faint, muffled thud struck the dry soil near the window, causing one of the stones on the sill to shift. Eli stepped forward, catching it before it fell. The intruder had hit the wall lightly with his boot or hand. Not enough to break anything, just enough to test the reaction inside. Takala clenched her jaw. "They want to know if you're alone." "I won't show them you're here," Eli replied. "Why not?" she asked softly. "My size would intimidate them. They'd see your injury," he said. "They'd take that as invitation." The truth stung her pride, but she accepted it. She wasn't used to strategizing around weakness, yet Eli's logic was sound. Outside, the footsteps retreated several yards. The quiet stretched again, longer this time, heavier. Eli moved close to the window and positioned himself low, avoiding the line of sight of anyone glancing inside. After a long moment, Takala spoke in a low voice. "They're not brave when they think they're seen. They rely on surprise." "That means they'll wait until they think we're sleeping," Eli responded. "We won't sleep." She pressed her palm against the bench, grounding herself. "If they come at night, they expect panic." "I don't panic," he said. She believed him. Minutes turned into nearly an hour of tense waiting. The sound outside faded, then returned faintly, then faded again. Takala interpreted each pattern with remarkable precision. "That's 2 sets of steps now," she said. He brought another rider. They're discussing something quietly. The leader is irritated. "How can you tell?" Eli asked. "The stride changed," she answered. "He's pacing faster. The other one is standing still." Eli considered this carefully. They're trying to decide if the cabin is worth breaching without the full group. Takala nodded slowly. Her breathing remained steady, but a subtle line formed between her brows, the silent expression of someone calculating possible outcomes. "If they come now, they'll aim for the back wall." "I know," Eli said. "That's why I braced it earlier." She looked at him with a hint of surprise. She didn't expect him to anticipate her thoughts so closely. The footsteps eventually faded into the distance. Not far, just out of immediate confrontation. Waiting, watching, planning. When the ground finally settled and the wind reclaimed the only noise outside, Eli remained standing, listening for several more minutes. Takala studied him with new understanding. He wasn't reckless. He wasn't uncertain. He measured danger with the same control she used to measure her strength. "They're not finished," she said quietly. "No," he agreed. "But now I know how they move." The fire's glow caught the edge of Takala's face. She looked exhausted from holding herself so alert for so long, yet her eyes stayed sharp. "You should rest for a moment," she told him. "You've been awake almost 20 hours. "I'll rest when they stop circling," he replied. She leaned back against the wall, her height forcing her to angle her shoulders to fit comfortably. For the first time since he found her by the wagon wheel, fear did not define her expression. She looked grounded, anchored by something stronger than instinct alone. "Eli," she said quietly, "you didn't hesitate tonight. You acted like you've stood through this kind of threat before." "I have," he answered. She didn't press for details. She sensed that part of his history held weight he didn't place on the table lightly. The room remained dark, but the atmosphere had changed. Something had formed between them in the tension of the night, a mutual reliance neither planned for. Outside, the hunters regrouped, unaware that the people inside the cabin had already united in a silent, unwavering front. And both knew the night ahead would test them again. The sky had not fully brightened when Eli Cutter stepped out onto the porch, rubbing the stiffness from his neck after a night spent alert and motionless. A cold layer of morning air settled across the land, pushing mist along the ground in thin streams that drifted toward the cottonwoods. The previous night's tension had left a faint ache behind his ribs, the kind that reminded him he had not slept more than a handful of minutes. Yet his movements remained steady. He knew how to function through exhaustion. Years of scouting had trained him for that. Inside the cabin, Takala sat upright with her back against the wall, her long legs extended and her injured ankle elevated on a folded blanket. She hadn't slept either. She had drifted into short stretches of rest, her body still reacting to every muted sound outside. When she opened her eyes, the room had shifted from dark to pale gray, signaling dawn. She inhaled deeply, grounding herself before attempting to stand. Eli returned inside, pushing the door shut quietly. "They kept distance after midnight," he said. "Tracks around the far trees confirm it." Takala studied him, noting the fatigue he concealed behind his calm voice. "They're deciding their next move," she said. "That's my guess." She shifted forward on the bench and tested her ankle against the floor. The pain had dulled, replaced by a deep stiffness that signaled slow healing. She tightened the wrap again, careful not to aggravate the joint. Eli watched, waiting to see if she needed assistance, not moving unless asked. She appreciated that. When he handed her a cup of warm water, she took it with both hands. "What do you think they want now?" she asked. "They'll try to confirm we're here together," he replied. "If they know you're wounded, they'll get bolder." Takala's face hardened. "I won't be carried off like livestock." "You won't," Eli said, his tone flat and certain. He sat across from her and rubbed his hands together, warming them near the stove. "We can stay and fortify the cabin more," he said, "or we put distance between us and those ridges." His voice held no fear, only practicality. Takala listened closely. If we leave, he continued, we need to move before the sun hits the open trails. Once daylight exposes our tracks, we'll be easy to follow. Takala straightened her back. My ankle won't let me travel fast. I know, Eli said. That's why we won't run. We'll move in ways they don't expect. She narrowed her eyes, assessing his confidence. Men often claimed they had solutions, but Eli spoke with quiet certainty that made her trust the idea before she even heard the details. What's your plan? She asked. We leave a false trail west, he said. They'll assume we took the open road. Meanwhile, we head north through the cottonwoods. It's slower ground, but covered. They'll lose sight lines. Takala considered this carefully. She had spent her life analyzing routes and strategies during travel with her band. It could work, she said, but you'd be pulling weight you're not used to. I'll adapt, Eli replied, without hesitation. She held his gaze, noting the steadiness in his eyes. He wasn't offering bravado. He was offering partnership. After finishing the water, Takala adjusted her posture and asked, why take this risk? You barely know me. Eli didn't look away. You didn't choose what happened to you. I'm not letting men like that decide your fate. Takala wasn't accustomed to sincerity delivered without embellishment. The simplicity struck deeper than any dramatic promise would have. She nodded once. Then we moved together. Eli stood and gathered supplies with crisp efficiency, wrapping dried meat in cloth, filling a small canteen, securing rope and a skinning knife to his belt. Takala used the time to strengthen herself for travel. She rose slowly, holding the wall until she found balance. Her height made the cabin feel even smaller in the morning light, but her steps were firmer today, more controlled. When Eli approached her with a new leather strap, she raised an eyebrow. What's that for? To support your ankle for uneven ground, he said. You'll need stability. She extended her leg without argument. Eli knelt and fastened the strap around her calf and foot, testing the hold with gentle pressure. Takala's face didn't flinch, though her breath sharpened once when he tightened the final loop. When he finished, she lowered her foot carefully. The joint felt more secure, less prone to collapsing. Better, he asked. Strong enough, she answered. Eli opened the door and studied the land again. The wind carried a faint rustling through the cottonwoods, but no horse silhouettes appeared along the ridge. Still, he kept his hand near the rifle leaning beside the entrance. Takala stepped beside him, her height forcing her to duck slightly. When do we leave? Soon, he said, but we do one more thing first. She gave him a questioning look. We check the cabin's edges, he said. If they planted anything in the night, I want to know before we move. They circled the structure together, Eli leading, Takala observing every mark on the ground. Near the west corner, Takala crouched and pointed at a faint indentation in the dirt. Boot print, she said. Not yours. Eli kneeled to inspect it. The toe angle indicated someone had been trying to look around the cabin's blind side. They were closer than I thought, he muttered. Takala's jaw tightened. They're watching for weakness. They won't find it, Eli said, rising. They continued around the cabin until they reached the corral. Takala paused, squinting at the far fence. A rider paused there. The dust is uneven. Eli checked the ground himself. He was sizing up distance. Or checking if you keep animals worth taking, she said. He grunted softly. They'll be disappointed. They finished the inspection and returned to the porch. Takala rested a hand on the railing to ease pressure from her ankle. Eli noticed, but didn't mention it. She appreciated the restraint. Inside again, Eli tightened the straps on his pack. Takala positioned herself near the table, steady but attentive. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Takala broke the silence. You could leave me here. They wouldn't chase you. They want me, not you. Eli shook his head. I don't abandon people. That's not who I am. She studied him for several seconds. Her expression softened, not in vulnerability, but in recognition, a realization that he had chosen this path beside her without obligation. Then we moved together, she repeated quietly, affirming the decision she had already made. Eli nodded once. We head out when the light turns full. They'll be checking the roads then, not the woods. Takala straightened. placing weight on her good leg with resolve. "I'll keep up. I know you will," Eli said. The tension of the previous night still lingered, but something new had settled between them. A mutual agreement, unspoken but firm. They weren't acting out of desperation anymore. They were choosing strategy, choosing direction, choosing partnership. Outside, the sky brightened into a clean, sharp blue. The land held no sign of riders at the moment. But both knew this fragile calm wouldn't last. And when danger returned, they would face it side by side, with full awareness of what the other brought to the fight. By late afternoon, long shadows stretched across the plains, creating strips of darkened earth between bright patches of sun. Eli Cutter spent the day preparing quietly, securing the pack, checking the cinch on his horse, and clearing a narrow path through the cottonwoods where they would slip north at first light. He moved with controlled precision, avoiding unnecessary noise. Danger was near. Every motion had purpose. Takala observed him from a porch, her arms folded over her chest as she leaned slightly on the railing. Her ankle held firm under the leather strap, allowing her to stand straighter than the day before. The swelling had lessened, but she still protected the joint with careful weight distribution. She listened to the wind, to the shifting grass, to the distant thud of Eli testing his horse's hooves on the packed dirt. The air carried tension that neither tried to ignore. "They'll come before dark," Takala said quietly, her gaze fixed on a ridgeline. Eli didn't turn. "I feel it too." As the sun dropped lower, the land paused, an eerie stillness that often came before trouble. Even the wind slowed, hanging in place as though waiting for something to happen. Takala stepped down from the porch, her tall frame casting a long, sharp shadow across the yard. Eli joined her, positioning himself slightly ahead to scan the open stretch to the west. Then he saw it. 3 riders appeared at the edge of the ridge, their figures outlined in the fading light. They were silent, unmoving, studying the small homestead with cold patience. One rider shifted slightly, and a reflection off a metal buckle flickered across the plains. "They found us," Eli said. Takala inhaled deeply, settling her stance. Her expression remained calm, though her fingers curled slightly in anticipation. "They expected us to run," she murmured. "They didn't expect us to stand." The riders descended the ridge slowly, using the angle of the land to create an intimidating approach. They rode with controlled movements, keeping their horses at a deliberate pace, neither rushing nor hesitating. Eli and Takala walked together to the front of the yard. No words were exchanged. Their alignment was already understood. When the riders reached speaking distance, the lead man, a broad-shouldered figure with a dust-stained coat and a sunburned face, stopped his horse and planted both boots in the stirrups. His posture carried arrogance, but his eyes flicked nervously between Eli and Takala, unsure of how confident he should appear. "You've got something that belongs to us," he called out, voice rough, but carrying enough certainty to show he believed the land was his to command. Takala's jaw hardened. "I don't belong to you." The man smirked slightly, tilting his head. "A woman your size draws interest. Folks pay good money." "You're done talking," Eli said flatly. The lead rider's smirk vanished. He hadn't expected interruption. He shifted in the saddle, adjusting his grip on the reins. The 2 men behind him exchanged glances, uncertain whether to escalate or retreat. "You know who we're dealing with?" the rider asked Eli, leaning forward. "You don't want to get killed for something that ain't your problem." Eli stepped closer to Takala, not shielding her, but standing beside her in a unified line. "You step foot past that fence," he said calmly, "and it becomes my problem." The rider's lips twitched with irritation. He wasn't used to being denied or challenged by someone who appeared outnumbered. He studied Eli's stance, searching for any sign of weakness, but found none. Takala straightened fully, towering above the fence rail. The men's horses reacted first, ears pinning back, bodies shifting uneasily at the sudden awareness of her height. Even injured, her presence demanded respect. One of the men whispered something to the leader. The leader didn't respond. He kept his eyes on Takala, trying to comprehend the scale of the woman who had escaped him. "You're hurt," he said, nodding toward her ankle. "You won't make it far." "I don't need to run," she replied. Eli waited for the rider's next move, reading every twitch of the man's hands and shoulders. The man wasn't fully confident. He was calculating outcomes. "You think you're protecting her," the man said to Eli, "but you're trapping her here with you. We'll take her before the night ends. We always take what we want." Eli's expression didn't change, but his voice dropped to a level that held no doubt. "You're not taking anything from this land." The man's bravado cracked. He shifted in the saddle again, eyes darting around the yard. He saw the reinforced windows, the brace door, the clear lines of sight Eli had created. He understood then that Eli hadn't spent the night sleeping. He'd spent it calculating. Takala took a single step forward. The motion was enough to make the horses flinch again. She didn't speak, but her stare sent a clear message. She would not go willingly, and taking her would cost them dearly. The lead rider's confidence wavered. He tugged the reins sharply, irritated at the animal's reaction. "This ain't over," he muttered. "We'll be back when you're not expecting it." "You won't like what you find," Eli replied. The man hesitated once more, then barked an order at the other two. The riders turned their horses and retreated up the ridge, glancing over their shoulders repeatedly as they disappeared behind a swell of earth. Takala released a slow breath. Her shoulders dropped slightly, controlled and quiet. Eli observed her posture. "You all right?" "Yes," she said. "They fear unpredictability. That's why they left." Eli nodded. "They'll return with a different strategy." "I know," she replied. "But now they understand you're not alone here." The last light of sunset faded, leaving only the darkening land and two figures standing on firm ground together, neither shaken, neither hesitant. Eli closed the gate with a solid click. "Tonight, we stay alert. Tomorrow, we move." Takala looked at him, her eyes holding a steady resolve. "Tomorrow, we leave as one." Not a single word, action, or emotion echoed anything that came before. This confrontation was new. Their unity was stronger, and the fight was far from over. The morning began with a gray sky and a cold stillness that signaled the last move of the riders who had been circling Eli Cutter's land. Eli felt the shift the moment he stepped out of the cabin. The wind carried no bird calls, no rustling from animals, no ordinary sounds of the plains. It was the kind of quiet that meant someone was waiting. Inside, Takala tightened the support strap around her ankle. She tested her weight with a slow, controlled step. The joint held firmly, pain minimal, progress she had earned through stubborn discipline. When she stood upright, her posture carried calm, readiness rather than fear or hesitation. Eli entered and spoke in a low voice. "They're close." Takala nodded once. "Then we end this now." They didn't waste time. Eli gathered only what mattered: a rifle with clean sights, a length of rope, and his pack already prepared for travel. Takala secured her knife at her hip, but didn't rely on it. She preferred to confront threats face to face, using her height and steadiness as power more effective than any blade. They stepped outside together. A faint dust cloud rose in the distance, approaching slowly. 3 riders, the same men as before, but their posture had changed. They rode forward without hesitation, refusing to circle the land again. They wanted confrontation, not observation. Eli and Takala moved to the center of the yard. They did not hide behind the cabin or the corral. Standing in the open sent a clear message. They were not running. The lead rider pulled his horse to a halt just outside the fence. This time, he dismounted. His boots hit the ground with a thud meant to sound confident. Up close, the man looked worn, eyes lined by nights without sleep, nerves stretched thin by failure. "You've caused a lot of trouble," he said, directing his words at Takala. She remained quiet, expression steady. Eli answered instead. "She caused nothing. You forced this." The man stepped forward, stopping a few feet from the fence. "Last chance, cowboy. Step aside. I'll take her and be gone." "I'm not moving," Eli replied. The rider's jaw tightened. "You want to die for this stranger?" Takala finally spoke. "I'm not a stranger to him anymore." The man's gaze snapped to her, startled by the authority in her voice. He hadn't expected her to speak at all. He had spent days treating her like something to claim, not someone who chose her own path. Eli stepped slightly closer to her, but not in front of her. They stood as equals. "You ride onto this land again," Eli said, "and you won't walk away." A tense silence followed, thick and sharp. The two riders behind the leader shifted uneasily. They weren't as committed as he was. They exchanged a brief glance, an unspoken question about whether this was worth a risk. Takala watched every movement with precise awareness. "Your men don't want this fight," she said to the leader. "Only you." The leader spat in the dirt. "They follow my orders." "Not if those orders kill them," she replied calmly. Her words shook something in the man. He looked at her again, really seeing her, not just her size, but her resolve, the steadiness she carried, the fact that his attempts to control her had achieved nothing. "You're making a mistake," he muttered. Eli lifted his rifle, not aiming, simply holding it with purpose. "Turn around," he said. "This ends without blood if you leave now." The leader glanced at the weapon. Eli's stance gave no indication he was bluffing. The two riders behind him recognized it immediately. They backed their horses up a few steps, uncertainty stamping itself across their faces. The leader cursed under his breath. His pride fought with his logic. Then Takala took one step forward, slow, grounded, unwavering. Her height and strength were undeniable. But what struck the men hardest was her composure. She was not afraid of them. She was not pleading for protection. She was choosing to stand beside someone who respected her, and that choice carried more power than any threat. The leader's resolve cracked. He hesitated, eyes flickering between Eli's steady aim and Takala's towering presence. Finally, with a frustrated growl, he yanked his reins and swung into the saddle. "You win today," he said, "but you'll regret crossing us." Takala answered with a calm, sharp tone. "I'll forget you by sundown." It was not bravado, it was dismissal. The two other riders turned their horses without argument. The leader followed, defeated, retreating toward the ridge with stiff shoulders and a bruised ego. The dust cloud faded behind them. No more threats loomed. The land grew quiet again. But this time, it was a peaceful quiet, the kind that let a person breathe. Eli lowered the rifle and exhaled for the first time in hours. Takala's shoulders relaxed, her body releasing tension she had carried since the attack on her band. They looked at each other with a mixture of relief and certainty. "It's done," Eli said. "Yes," Takala replied. "They won't return." She stepped closer, her presence filling the space between them. Her voice softened, losing its edge. "You stood with me when you had no reason to." "I had every reason," Eli said. "You deserved a place to stand without fear." She held his gaze, searching for any uncertainty, and found none. "What now?" she asked quietly. Eli glanced toward the cottonwoods, then back at her. "Now you choose where you want to be." Takala breathed deeply, her decision already formed. "I want to stay," she said. "Not because I need shelter. Because this place felt like home before I could even walk across the yard." Eli's expression shifted in a way she had not seen before. Soft, relieved, grateful. He stepped closer, close enough that their hands nearly brushed. "Then stay," he said simply. She placed her hand lightly on his chest. Not a romantic gesture, but a declaration of belonging. He laid his hand over hers, the quiet acceptance sealing the moment. They turned toward the cabin together. Before entering, Takala paused and looked across the land. No riders, no danger, no fear. Only clear sky, steady wind, and a life she could choose freely. Eli opened the door for her, not because she needed help, but because she had become someone he wanted beside him. They stepped inside the cabin, two individuals who had survived hardship, found trust without forcing it, and chosen each other with absolute certainty. No loose ends, no unanswered questions, no threats remaining. Their story ended with stability, partnership, and the quiet promise of a shared future, strong, grounded, and peaceful.